Hi, and welcome to this new episode of my podcast debut, where I interview people like Katharina who are in the process of starting their podcast, and hopefully, it gives you the inspiration, the knowledge, and the motivation to start your own podcast as well. Katharina, I'd love to ask you first. Well, thank you for joining. And is it your first podcast?
No, I've been to a few podcasts before. Thank you so much for inviting me, having me over today. Yeah, no, I've been invited to a few podcasts before, usually to talk about what I mainly talk about, which is pranayama and breathing therapy and chakras and all kind of that stuff that is work related.
Mm. Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And just for the viewer, the format looks different than usual because Riverside, there was an issue on your end, Katharina, that we didn't know why. So we went on Zoom. But actually, part of this podcast is to be an experiment and to try different things. So when you're a podcast host, it can happen that there's a technical issue, and then it's good to have a plan B. So for me, I usually record on Riverside, but if there's something I know I can also record on Zoom. And here you have the result. And I haven't recorded on Zoom for a while for a podcast. I think my last maybe 40 or 50 online episodes were on Riverside. So it's actually really interesting to see how it's gonna turn out using Zoom. Yeah, so that's just to explain why the different format than usual. So I'd love to get into it now, Katharina. What is your podcast idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, should be something about my work. So, as I mentioned before, I'm a pranayama teacher. I teach like classical pranayamas, but also more modern breathing techniques that are more about breathing therapy. So, I'm really working with people who have health issues that we can cure with breathing techniques. And of course, pranayamas. And I work a lot with the chakra system. So that all would give me a lot of topics to talk about for sure. And yeah, I've been thinking doing something, of course, about these topics, but also since I've been a solopreneur for 5 years now, and I know that a lot of my followers, for example, on Instagram and other social media platforms, they love to hear about how I got there, how also living abroad and having an online businesses and stuff like that. So I was thinking about bringing that also a little bit into the mix, but yeah, I don't have a concrete plan yet.
Mm. Amazing. Thank you, Katharina. And it's always an interesting question. Like, do I want to niche down to more what I'm doing with my business, or do I also want people to see other facets of me with the
Mhm.
podcast? And both are potentially totally valid and good ways to go about it. I'd love to ask you to, do you have specific goals with this podcast?
Well, yes and no, of course. I have goals. Mainly, it would be really a type of long content that I would like to do because I'm not a big writer. I just don't enjoy it. So I don't enjoy writing blog posts, for example, or writing endless newsletters and stuff like this. Of course, I do it, but mostly I'm active on Instagram at the moment. But I feel it's very necessary also for your the followers and clients you have already to have more of a long format content. And I know that people do enjoy it, and that's what I was thinking about, like doing a podcast or doing YouTube as well. Of course, you can also put your podcast on YouTube, but yeah, I think speaking is something that is relatively easy for me. So I can just sit and talk for hours. And also, like, I do a lot of breathing meditations, for example, which would be also nice to have on the podcast. So, yeah, mainly to have something for my existing followers, clients to get a little bit more knowledge, more longer content as well, where I can explain a little bit more and give them a little bit more details than, let's say, on a 30-second Instagram reel, for example. Because with the short content, which is great in one way, but on the other hand, it's really hard to like really transport topics that maybe need a little bit more explaining, for example. But yeah, why I was also thinking about the podcast is that I heard, I'm sure you can probably let me and the other people who are listening to your podcast know that podcasts are not really a medium to be found, not something to really like acquire new clients, let's say, which is of course everybody's coaches or pranayama teachers favorite, because in the end we all want or need more clients, and we all want or need people that find us on different channels. That why I was a little bit also struggling or thinking about, should I do a podcast? Is it really like worth the time and the effort?
Thank you, Katharina. And this is a really good comment. Well, a few things there. Well, first, I totally echo what you share about the long form. It's really a way to create trust
Mm-hmm.
and people to know and trust you. Let's say that is really hard to create with shorts. Like people can really sit down and spend time with you and get to know you
Yeah.
and trust you this way. So I like it. And also, a podcast can be an Instagram strategy. Most of my Instagram is actually extracts from podcasts. So you can
Mm-hmm.
repurpose and it can actually be quite efficient, especially with podcasts with guests who have a good following. So these are a couple of comments on what you shared. And then
Mm-hmm.
about um, existing client or finding new clients. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually, because um, I think it's really good to have something for existing clients, but I do believe it's important for the podcast to also serve as a way for people to want to work with you and to discover you even. So
Mm-hmm.
I generally recommend to prioritize YouTube for the podcast for that reason. Is that I agree with you that on Spotify, for example, people will rarely find you. They will most
Mm-hmm.
likely go on Instagram, find you. Oh, she has a podcast, subscribe on Spotify. So that's possible. However, people will rarely go on Spotify and say, ha, uh, and type technique breathings to relax my nervous system. But they
Yeah,
will do
of
that on
course.
YouTube.
Yeah.
They will do that on YouTube though. They will actually go on YouTube and be like, how do I do pranayama? Even you can go niche like pranayama for Westerner women in their 40s, for example. People will type that on YouTube. And so then if you have a podcast about that, people will find your podcast on YouTube. So actually, to start with, posting on YouTube is the second biggest search engine in the world. So it's definitely
I
a
know.
great way to be discovered by people who don't know you yet. There's a little bit of things to know about it on how to package it for that. And also, then, even with your podcast, you can do it in a way that's very tailored to support your coaching business. An example is what I'm doing right now with this podcast. So, I have two podcasts. And this podcast, more new podcast that I started with my podcast coaching, was very directly talking about podcasts and it's very close to my business. So, you can also tailor the podcast to support directly supporting your business. Yeah.
Mm.
I would love to ask you, when do you want to, well, first, how does that land?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's just like what I'm always a little bit afraid of, what is keeping me a little bit from actually starting it is because, especially when you do it on YouTube, which makes total sense what you say. So before I started being a pranayama teacher 5 years ago, I actually used to work in marketing. So I'm quite familiar with all the marketing channels and stuff like that. And I've been digging a little bit into it as well. But what I always also thought or still think is that when you put your podcast on YouTube, I have the feeling you need a lot of technical equipment and you really need to do a lot of cuttings that people really stay and listen to your podcast and not get like bored if they just have to, yeah, look at a semi good recording with like whatever decent kind of quality and just you talking face front to them for let's say 20
Mm.
minutes or something. And is what a little bit is keeping me, because yeah, I'm a solopreneur. I work by myself. I have a lot to do. And if I just think that starting a podcast, which I would really love, and also like finding topics and talking is not even the problem, but just thinking like doing the recording and then maybe sitting there and cutting it for an hour or two or whatever to make it nice and presentable and then put it out there on YouTube is where I'm a little bit afraid. If I have to buy a lot of expensive equipment, I have to learn how to cut properly and all that stuff first. This is I think the technical part is a lot what's keeping a lot of people from it probably, and which is also my biggest part where I'm like, should I do it? Can I do it? Do I have the time to do it? Do I have the knowledge to do it?
Amazing, thank you. And do you want to do mainly solo or with guests or a mix of both?
I think, well, like I said before, I don't have a proper, like, finalized concept or everything. I think I would start with solo episodes, and I don't even know if in the beginning I could make it once a week. Maybe it's only every second week or something like that. I would probably start solo, to be honest. And then maybe later on bring people if I see like it's working, it's worth it, people are listening, people are interested and stuff like that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and they both have their advantages and their more complexities also on both
Mm.
sides. So I won't get too into it now, but it's good to know for solo. Um, Look, it really depends on your style and how comfortable you are.
Mm.
Because for some people, it's going to be actually easier to start with guests because having a conversation like you and I are having right now is actually fairly easy because we're just talking and you're in the flow and it's harder
Mm.
to be in your head. It's just much more natural. And for a conversation like this, there's almost no editing, right? You can publish it as it
Mm.
is. So then you can just invite guests. There's some more complexities around the process of inviting guests and having someone else. But in general, it's going to be easier just to speak, and then there's almost no editing. When you do solo, it's in theory much easier because you just need your camera and you can start recording. However, depending on how comfortable you are, some people will really struggle to talk to a camera and be very hesitant, and that creates a lot of editing. But if you're comfortable, potentially there's no editing. You don't need to have a super fast-paced edited video to do really well. I have many examples of people who literally just put a camera on, start
Mm.
recording, and have sometimes millions of views with a 3 hour video of them talking. One
Mm.
example would be actualize.org on YouTube. He's doing videos on spirituality. It's just him speaking. There's no change of cameras, nothing. At the moment, there's a guy doing really well in business called William Brown. He's in his office and talking to you like he'd be speaking with you. And so there is a lot of that trend on YouTube of
Mm.
just authentic, uncut conversation. But that requires a certain level of mastery in terms of
Mm.
public speaking and knowing what you're talking about and being comfortable in front of the camera. So do you feel like, let's just say if you can speak pretty well, actually it doesn't need much tech editing, not at all. So how does
Mm.
that land?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been a public speaker for years. I used to work in advertising, as I said. I was used to like talking in front of 200 to 500 people every week. I'm used to teaching mainly online since 5 years. So if I can do one thing, I think it's talking straight into a camera. That's not a problem for me at all. Yeah.
Okay, so then typically an episode a week could be like about an hour of your time
Yeah.
every week. It would be a matter
You
of
really
you
give
being
me
in
a good
front of your
feeling
camera.
about this.
Yeah, like you
Yeah.
could almost post every day. Like if it's just you, you press play, and you start speaking, and
Yeah.
it's good and it's done. That's a YouTube video. That's what I've been doing with some videos on this channel. It's uncut. I post on YouTube. I just sometimes cut the first 2 or 3 seconds, but directly on my iPhone 15, which is what I use to
Mm.
record. You could do this even more easily on the laptop, and then you can post 2 3 times a week. I would say
Mm.
no problem. Yeah. How would that
Okay.
feel?
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds good. Actually, yeah, you're really encouraging me because I thought like, oh my God, there's all this technical stuff that I have to do, which I know it takes a lot of time if you have to sit there, edit, cut, do whatever. But yeah, I mean, sounds good, definitely. And like I said, I don't have problems speaking. I will definitely not have problems like finding topics. And what I also thought, like, in my opinion, and also I think for my listeners, they will probably also like if it's just a 10-minute talk about something, about one topic, for example. I also heard from a lot of friends who have podcasts already, they said, actually, the people like the mix who are listening to their podcast. They like it if it's sometimes a bit shorter, sometimes a bit longer, sometimes they have a guest, sometimes they just do a meditation for 10-15 minutes or something like that. So I think it could be a nice mix also to ease things up, give a little bit more yeah, different things so it doesn't get too boring if I only sit there and talk for like 5 hours every week, but to have a little bit of a mix about a few different topics and a few different, yeah, also length of the podcast. And that would give people the opportunity to also, like the people who are maybe already following me on Instagram, to get to know me
Mhm.
a bit better, to get to know a bit more about certain topics. And also, yeah, as you explained it with YouTube, it's actually a channel that I've been interested in for a really long time, but also frankly never really had time to get into it, to make a proper like strategy for this channel. So that could be a great strategy actually, to have a new platform, to have a new podcast. And I mean, if you have the video, you can just upload the audio on Spotify and iTunes, I guess, right? So you could be on several platforms. Yeah. Sounds
Yes, exactly. Actually, you would upload the video to on Spotify because now Spotify
right. I heard that.
encourages video and
Mm,
gives more views to people who upload video.
true.
And
Yeah.
then you can connect it with iTunes and then it sends the audio to iTunes.
Yeah.
Indeed, and yeah, it's totally a way to promote and to get new clients. I mean, with this podcast, I'm doing it, and what you can do is in the middle of your episodes, you can talk to your audience and tell them about something you're creating that maybe they're interested in, or a freebie, or booking a call. And by the
Yeah.
way, for everyone watching this episode, thank you so much for watching. And if you too consider starting a podcast, maybe you want to come on the show like Katharina is doing right now and talk
Mm,
about it. If that's the case, check the link in the description, or if you're still shy, I'd be happy to have a talk with you also and help you burst that podcast or even grow it, monetize it, develop it. So make sure to reach out. And yeah, that's totally a way you can promote your offer
mm,
within a podcast. You can also have clients that can be quite powerful to get uh,
mm,
taste of your work also. But I like the way
yeah.
you mix it up like this. I think that's really cool. I'd love to ask you even more. Can we be even more specific? Because I think it's awesome to start a podcast, to do what you're passionate about, to talk about the topics and have fun with it and explore things, and I think that's really important. And at the same time, I've noticed that for people to prioritize it, it works much better if they have clear goals and they feel they're succeeding, whether it's getting new
Mm,
clients or having a certain number of views. So I'd love to ask you if you have specific goals that for you would define success with it and would get you to prioritize it. And that could be, yeah, a certain number of views or clients. Uh,
mm.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always have goals and KPIs in my business, because I think it's really important also to know where you stand with certain channels or products or whatever. So I would definitely have to make that. I haven't yet, but in the end, as with every product I have, it would be sales in the end, because of course, like if everybody on Instagram is saying like, hey, great course, but nobody is buying it, I'd be like, well, then maybe it's not so great after all, right? And then I would maybe thinking about doing a different course or launching a different product or something like that. And I think in the end, well, the main goal should really be to give people the possibility to get to know me a little bit better and stuff like that. And also, if I go on YouTube, to find me and learn things. But yeah, then in the end, it would be about sales. So I would see to it that more or less, maybe not every episode. I don't want to be like super pushy and salesy like all the time, like buy my stuff, buy my stuff, buy my stuff. But of course, I would see to it that I'll be like, I mean, I have several products which launch at different times of the year. I have freebies, I have a mini product and stuff like that. So of course I would see to it that I do exactly what you just did, where you said like, hey, come to my show. I'd probably be like, hey, I have, oh, by the way, with this topic, I have a breathing meditation on my website that you can download for
Mm.
whatever, how many euros, or oh, my next teacher training is starting soon, or are you interested in chakras? Well, I have a chakra pranayama course that you could buy and stuff like that. So I would always see to it that I'm, yeah, doing advertising for myself and my products. And of course, also like try to fit the topics for the podcast with the topics of the launches that are coming up. So let's say when I'm launching my chakra course, of course, probably before that, I would do a bit more about chakras, energy work, how
Mm.
does pranayama and chakras work together and stuff like that. So I have a proper channel that actually makes sense and then also sells and brings me hopefully new clients, or maybe clients that have been following me around for a while, but we're never sure if they should buy, if it's the right thing for them, to then be like, oh yeah, I fully trust her as an expert in her field. I like her energy. Now I'm going to buy it finally. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And that's really good to have this clarity also, because then you can adapt a little bit the positioning of your podcast, the
Mm,
audience you're speaking to, as well
mm,
as yeah, the content you're doing based on knowing this. And you can also alternate the episodes with different intentions. So you could have an
mm.
episode where you have a conversation with someone who has a big following, for example, and you know they're going to cross
Yeah.
promote. So that's going to bring a lot of eyeballs to your YouTube
Yeah.
channel and to your podcast. And then the next episode, maybe you have a former client talking about their transformation
Right.
with the work with
Yeah.
you. And potentially that episode will get maybe 10 times less views, but the people who view that, they will convert much more. So you can have some
Correct.
episodes that are more to get more
Yeah.
reach and some episodes that are more towards conversion. And it's okay to have some variety as long as you're speaking roughly to the same audience and avatar. That's more the
100%.
important thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in my business, of course, I have a overall business strategy. I have my target group. My target group is already quite niche because my target group, of course, sometimes it's not the target group in the end who buys, but mainly they are yoga teachers. So that
Mm.
is quite a niche down, I would say, although there are hundreds of thousands of yoga teachers out there, but still it's quite a niche that I'm mainly talking to yoga teachers, how they can incorporate pranayamas, mudras, and mantras and everything into their sessions. So I think that would be quite I would definitely stay with that niche as well because it just fits with my whole business. So I wouldn't probably really change the niche here. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing.
Mm.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you speak really well. You know your thing really well. You already have that niche, so I think you're going to be widely successful with it. Yeah.
You're so encouraging me now. I'm really like, okay, let's go. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good. That's
Yeah.
good. I
When
needed
do you
that
want to start?
encouragement. Ah, good question. I'll honestly, I'll probably have to start in about, let's say maybe mid-May I would attempt, because at this moment I have so much to do that it wouldn't be wise to start something new right now. Because for me, it's always like when I start something, I want to do it correctly. Like I want to do it 100%. That's the German in me, of course. So I don't think it would be wise to start something half-ass right now without because I want to sit down, I want to write a strategy, I want to have the first content thingies lined up, maybe already ask some people to come on the show. You sold that quite well as well. So thank you so much for all your insights. It's really, really helpful and really encouraging. So I want to have a proper concept to start out with. So probably maybe starting mid-May. Before that, I have a ton of other products I have to finish up, which is a bit time sensitive. So that's nothing I can push. but the podcast I still can push a little bit. And then I would think of also doing like batch recording, you know, like I do with all my other content creation. I think it's nice to have a few episodes already lined up and not be like, oh shit, it's Monday, I need to record my episode and then I don't have time, or you're traveling somewhere and stuff like that. And if I start the project, I want to be like 100% and not then keep people waiting and saying like, oh, next episode will be out in a week. And then they'll be waiting and I'll be like, oops, sorry, didn't have time. So yeah, I want to do it correctly. But I think end of May for the first episode to be out on YouTube, that would be a good goal, I think.
Amazing, amazing. I love that. And yeah, I can feel you're someone who likes to have those systems in place. And for a podcast, it's actually quite important because a lot of people never start, and that's sad. But also, a lot of people start and get overwhelmed and don't get the result and stop.
Exactly.
90% will stop before episode 10. And having good systems and thinking it through before is good too. So I like your approach taking some time because for some people, like a lot of my content will be just get started, and there's wisdom for that. But I think it depends on where you're at. Like the type of people who should think just start. I want people who lack the confidence, and then it's like
Mm,
unblocking themselves. But that's not your case.
100%.
And the um, and so, because you're already quite comfortable with it, you don't need to just start for the personal development for yourself.
Mm, yeah.
You don't need that. When you need to start, you probably won't have too much of a blockage there. And the
Yeah.
other thing is, for some people it can be good to just start getting exposure. At the same
Mm,
time, it depends where you're at with your business. I believe there's a time to experiment with a lot of different things and do a lot and just go fast, and there's a time to start, when you start something, to do it properly. And when you're a
yeah.
little bit more advanced with your business, you don't want to just write a book at the same time start a podcast, and it's
Exactly.
that's here and there. You're like, okay, I already have my brand, I already have my business. If I
Yeah.
start a podcast, I'm gonna do it well, and I'm gonna do it in a month or in two
Yeah.
months. And when I do it, I do it. And I think that's very wise and smart. So yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Katharina. Do you have any other challenges or things you'd like to talk about on this episode?
That's a really good question. I think really what the most part that was keeping me is the technical part, which you already elaborated on. So that was very helpful. And I think now it's only for me to find really the concept, right? To like really think about what I want to talk about, also that it makes sense. Maybe that it's also not too broad of different topics. So I'm still struggling with, should I also bringing in the business perspective, or is that maybe something for later on, and maybe at the moment just stick with pranayama, breathing, everything that kind of stuff related, and then maybe later go a little bit further. Or yeah, I think that's what I'm mainly also struggling with at the moment, to find like a
Mm,
concept that makes sense, that gives people a little bit of variety, but is not too broad that people will be like, what is she talking about now? Is this a
mm,
business podcast? Is this a pranayama podcast? Is this a chakra podcast? Or what's going on here, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, and then it's gonna be a balance of, for sure. I think taking some time to figuring this out and starting off the right
Mm,
foot is good, and at the same time, you can't overthink these things. And it's gonna be, when you start, you'll feel what you like talking about, you'll feel what your
mm,
audience resonates with. You can look at the numbers and and what works and not, and the feedback of people. So what I like to say with podcasting is, it's almost like every episode is a new launch. So on one hand,
mm,
as we discussed, like if you already have a brand, it's worth taking a little bit of time to be like, okay, I'm going to do it well, position it well,
mm.
but only to a certain extent, because you'll
Yeah,
also
right.
go through go through like that trial and testing things, and seeing
Yeah.
what resonates, what you like, what your audience likes. So typically, when I work with people, for example, I typically take between usually around a week for the positioning. And this is because
Okay.
not doing it, I think, is too rushed and just be like, just record anything, you know.
Mm,
But also, like, we don't want to take much more than this because at some point the information will come from actually doing it. So that's
right. Right.
usually what I recommend. So that's when we're in a program and we're more focused on it. So I understand now you're less focused on it, but yeah, to me is that balance of taking a little bit of time at some point to sit down and take like a few hours or during a week or something where you're focused on it and be like, okay, I really think this through.
Right.
But then usually at the end of the week you might still have questions, but then it's like, okay, let's get started now with
Let's,
where
yeah.
I'm at. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think yeah, you're totally right, because that's what I also tell all my clients, just go and do it, and the rest, I mean, you also have to see, right, what do the people actually like you just said. So I think yeah, maybe trying a few things in the beginning is just normal to find out what really works, what works for you, what works for the audience and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the good thing is if you can speak pretty confidently and it's gonna be like someone is sitting with you, is gonna be very straightforward also and won't be too
Yeah.
time consuming.
Yeah, and I have a lot of people that I already know. They invited me to their podcasts before. So I'd already have a list of 5 to 10 people who I could easily invite and who would love to be on the podcast as well. So people that I know, that I've worked with before, that know me, where I know that would be definitely a good conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And as a parenthesis, you having a podcast, when you invite guests, that's also an opportunity to reach people who are kind of out
true.
of your reach.
Yeah,
Usually you have like 10 or
true.
20 times your following and they will be happy to
Yeah,
come as a guest.
yeah, yeah, that's a good point. True.
I mean, personally, it's kind of, I don't want to think of everything as status with numbers of follower, but if we put it this way, like if I invite people on a podcast, usually they have like 10 times my followers,
Yeah,
and if someone invites me on a podcast, I'm generally happy to go even if they have way less followers.
yeah, yeah.
Awesome, Katharina. We've been going for a bit already. It's been really interesting for me, for you, and for our viewer. Thank you for being here again. And I'd love to ask you, was this valuable?
Yes, absolutely. And especially, it really encouraged me to start now to, especially what you said about the technical stuff, like basically all my worries that I had. You really helped me to just not be so worried about it anymore. And just, yeah, it really encouraged me. It gives me a lot of motivation to really like go and do it now finally. So yeah, thank you. It was definitely helpful. And I'm super grateful that yeah, that you had me here in your podcast.
Mm, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, you started sharing already, but what are your main takeaways from today's conversation?
Yeah, what I just said, about really the encouragement and also your knowledge about certain things, like especially the technical part that I know worries most people always. And yeah, it was also good that we talked a little bit about a concept and stuff like that, and that you basically also said that yeah, just go do it and try out what works in the end. And you're totally right, like sometimes we get so into our head that we're like, okay, no, let's think a little bit more, because we don't want to start, or we don't get the last step to finally do it. And I think yeah, that really helped a lot.
Amazing. Thank you, Katharina. And yeah, I hope that was insightful also for the people watching this. You can like, subscribe, share if you want to support the channel. And I read and reply to all the comments. So if you have questions, takeaways you want to share, please do. And of course, come on the podcast, talk about your ID if you have your own podcast or YouTube channel ID. Much love, Katharina, and much love to everyone.
Thank you.